In today's podcast, I wish to bring to a conclusion these remarks on Schelling's historical critical introduction to the philosophy of mythology. My remarks today concern Lecture 10, or the final lecture, which is in many ways a transitional lecture, a lecture that is preparing the way for what is to come, which is the philosophy of mythology proper and its sequel, the philosophy of revelation. A point worth repeating is that the historical critical introduction to the philosophy of mythology is not philosophy. It is not a philosophical investigation of the history of religion. It is rather what he calls a new science, a historical critical investigation of the history of religion. For this reason, Schelling is compelled to review competing arguments from other historians endeavoring to explain the same facts. This somewhat explains why the historical critical introduction is so circuitous, so torturous to read. Notice that Schelling does not presuppose the doctrine of the potencies as a way of explaining the history of mythology. The doctrine of the potencies is a speculative result of negative philosophy, and it has not yet been brought to bear on the task at hand. Instead, we have a historical critical investigation which is examining mythology on its own terms. Schelling concludes the lectures by proclaiming the discovery of a new fact, quote, the existence of a theogonic process in the consciousness of the original humanity, end quote. So it's very important to see that Schelling regards the result of the historical critical introduction to the philosophy of mythology as a fact, and as such, it is a fact that needs to be explained. The explanation will be the philosophy of mythology and revelation as such. It will be speculative and abductive in that full sense of the term which we have already investigated in different contexts, particularly in the grounding of the positive philosophy. The doctrine of the potencies will be brought in as the result of the negative philosophy, as the product of, we could say, philosophical idealism, which will be deployed as an explanatory framework to make sense of this new fact. The fact of the existence of a theogonic process in the consciousness of the original humanity. Now, what exactly does Schelling mean by the existence of a theogonic process in consciousness of original humanity? He means that mythology is the history of the birth of the gods, that is a theogony, that polytheism is originally successive polytheism, and that this whole process does not happen in the world, but happens in consciousness. But as we've said earlier, not in consciousness understood in some subjective sense, as though it was the private revelations of individuals like Homer, but consciousness understood in a collective sense. In order to understand ancient theogony or polytheism as a triadic process, one needs to bring negative philosophy to bear on the issue. One needs the speculative hypothesis of the three potencies. We do not have that at our disposal in a historical critical study of the history of religion. All we have are the facts of religion. The facts of religion, according to Schelling, testify to polytheism as the original form of human religion, and that polytheism has a successive quality to it, such that later gods emerge to displace earlier gods with different properties that compensate and complement the properties of the earlier gods. Schelling does, however, discover a logic to history, and he roughs it out in this last lecture. He distinguishes three periods of human history. A first period, which he calls the absolutely prehistorical, a middle period, which he calls the relatively prehistorical, and a third period, which encompasses our present, which he calls historical. In the absolutely prehistorical period, there were no events. There was no before or after. In the relatively prehistorical, we have the time of mythological events, the time of the gods. The third era is the time of revelation, a time in which the gods are a thing of the past. These three eras are qualitatively distinct periods of time. You may have heard of Schelling's Ages of the World project, the failed effort to write a system of history, which occupied him from 1811 to 1815. In the Ages of the World project, he distinguished a past that was never present from a present that is never past, from a future that never arrives, as three qualitatively distinct forms of time, each of which must be in place if anything is to happen at all. Something of this idea of qualitatively distinct times resurges here in this argument that the relatively prehistorical period, mythology, is distinguished from the absolutely prehistorical period, and both are distinct from the historical period, the period of revelation, in terms of qualitatively distinct experiences of time. They are times that are reckoned by different forms of human consciousness. In the prehistorical time, the time of mythology, an inner necessity compels humanity to express itself in the form of mythology. This inner necessity also removes humanity from the real in a certain way. Mythology is like a collective psychosis, you could say. A people experience the world as determined by gods, and by so experiencing the world, they, in some respects, do not experience the world as it is in itself. This relatively prehistorical time is distinct from an absolutely prehistorical time. It looks back to it as its beginning. And in the absolutely prehistorical time, there are no distinctions between peoples, just as there are no distinctions between periods of history. There is no history as such. It is the time of the still undivided and unified humanity, Schelling writes. Now, Schelling realizes that time passes in the absolutely prehistorical period, but it passes as a kind of recurrence of a succession of moments, each of which is indistinguishable from what preceded it. Like the time of your childhood, in which you rose in the morning, played in the daytime, and slept at night, with each day being more or less indistinguishable from the other days, and the whole thing disappearing in a kind of eternity. Because the absolutely prehistorical time looks back to no previous time, because it can look back to no previous time, since there is no before for it, it is the first time. It is the original time. The relatively prehistorical time brings the absolutely prehistorical time to an end. The sundering of the peoples and the emergence of the gods and the experience of mythology as such. Just so, historical time brings the relatively prehistorical time to an end. Historical time brings mythology to an end. And that is the time that is inaugurated by the Christ event, the time of modernity. Schelling makes a very interesting argument at a certain point in this lecture concerning progress and history. His argument is that where there is no progress, there is no history. Schelling thereby reveals himself to be a modern. If we define modernity as that time in which human beings are determined by the belief in progress, the belief that the future will be different than the past and hopefully better, then Schelling is in every way a modern. He anticipates progress. He looks towards the future. He is looking towards a future form of religion which will bring the present form of religion to an end, just as the present form of religion brought the past form of religion to an end. So it's very important for Schelling to assume that history has an end in the sense of telos, or goal, a point towards which it is directed. If history has no end, according to Schelling, then history has no meaning. This connection between the belief in historical progress and the anticipated end of history, whether that's conceived as the second coming of Christ, or the utopian Marxist community, or the establishment of perfect peace on earth. On page 164 of the Historical Critical Introduction, Schelling writes, "With a historical time that goes on boundlessly, the door is opened to every caprice. True is not differentiated from false." Here Schelling anticipates an argument that was made famous by Heidegger student Karl Löwith in the early part of the 20th century. Löwith argued that the modern myth of progress depends upon Jewish-Christian eschatology, Jewish-Christian salvation history. Jewish-Christian messianic religion argues that humanity is on course towards a singularity, you could say, which will bring about the restoration of intimacy with the divine and overcome the alienation of people from one another, of people from nature, and of people from God. We are moving towards that point. And according to Leavitt, and it seems that Schelling anticipates in this regard, without this sense of a forward-moving trajectory of time, we would have no sense of history as such. There would be no way of distinguishing the true from the false, Schelling said. The door is open to every caprice. Anything would go. There would be no ethical or epistemological norm. Leavitt argues that the myth of progress survives Christianity, and with the death of God, we remain believers in progress, which we now conceive as scientific and technical progress. The world is moving towards some kind of technical singularity. But in the absence of the theological assumption that God exists and God is the author of history, we become nihilists. We believe in nothing. The most arbitrary exercises of power become justified. The most flagrant disregard for the truth becomes acceptable. The most mindless and hopeless hedonism becomes the norm. Schelling anticipates the collapse of the myth of progress into nihilism in some respects, but he would never believe that this is a definitive and final moment. He would rather regard the decay of Western Christendom as a detour, not the end of revelation, but a stage in its progress towards its future form. And I think this is Schelling's most important contribution to the debate concerning the death of God, secularism, and post-secularism. For Schelling, the secular age, the nihilistic age, is a stage in the development of revealed religion. And this, I think, is what Schelling's philosophy of mythology is finally achieving. A rethinking of the religion of Europe. A rethinking of the theological foundations of modernity. Conventionally, revealed religion was opposed to rational religion, particularly in the Enlightenment period, where rational religion was understood to be a religion that was founded upon assumptions that could be verified through reason alone, whether they were self-evident assumptions or demonstrably rational universal assumptions, such as Kant's categorical imperative. Rational religion, at least in its presumption, emancipates humanity from dependence on revelation. The Enlightenment deists and rationalists would emancipate humanity from dependence on all external authorities. Schelling doesn't deny that revealed religion and rational religion stand in some kind of tension. He rather denies that rational religion exists or has existed up until now. What Schelling anticipates in the future is a genuinely rational religion. He'll call it philosophical religion, and it has not yet existed because we are not yet ready for it. There is a further distinction in this conventional understanding of the relationship of reason and revelation, and that is the relationship of revelation or revealed religion to natural religion. Not in Schelling's specific sense of natural religion as mythological religion, but natural religion in the sense of the religion of people who live close to nature, the religion of the indigenous. This is typically understood to be some form of animism or nature worship. According to Schelling, there is no religion which consists in a simple worship of nature. This idea of natural religion is a construct of European Christendom, and if one looks at the facts, one sees that all religion, no matter how primitive or indigenous it might be, is an experience of divinities. All religion is polytheistic or mythological in its origins. Revealed religion and natural religion, then, share this fundamental feature of being dependent upon manifestations of divinity. In that regard, revealed religion and natural religion, that is, mythological religion, stand opposed to rational religion. And the opposition can be understood in logical terms as an opposition of external and internal experiences of divinity. In both revealed religion and natural religion, the experience of the divine is external. It's either the experience of the gods interceding in time, as in mythological religion, or it is the experience of God revealing God's self in time, in texts, in events, in prophetic utterances. And in both cases, God speaks to us from outside of reason. Revelation is symptomatic of alienation. In rational religion, should it exist at some point in the future, this alienation would be overcome. It wouldn't be the case that God would then cease to exist and humanity take its place, but rather that God or divinity, who is hitherto revealed as external to humanity, would become the internal principle of reason itself. Reason would spontaneously appropriate and express divine truth. The divine revelation, the divine knowledge, or the knowledge of the divine which we have received from outside, either in the form of mythology or in revelation, would now become a priori in a sense. It would become the property of reason itself. Reason would become divinized in the sense that it would now have as its content divine truth. The alienation would be overcome. So the perhaps most striking thing that Schelling did in the 19th century is make an argument for the continuity of polytheism and monotheism, of mythological religion and revealed religion. According to most Christian theologians at the time, there was no such continuity. Mythological religion was a religion of falsehoods. It was pure ideology. It was something that was constructed by people in darkness who had not yet heard the gospel. Schelling digs back to an older Christian interpretation of mythology, one of the oldest, in fact, the one that was advanced by the Alexandrian church fathers, who believed not that the pagans were worshipping falsehoods, but rather that the pagans were worshipping demons. Now, Schelling does not hold that all polytheistic gods are demonic. Some of them might be. But he does agree with this earlier patristic interpretation of polytheism, insofar as both the church fathers and Schelling regard the divinities which are expressed in mythological religion as real forces, as something which humanity encounters in time and which compels it, determines it, perhaps even enslaves it. Revelation, therefore, emancipates religion from this domination by divinities. The church fathers called them demons, Schelling calls them gods, but in both cases they are something far more real than constructs of the poets. Both natural religion and revealed religion, Schelling says, contain the same elements, but they mean different things. What he will go on to say is that both natural religion and revealed religion express the potencies, but in different ways. Only in revealed religion are the potencies understood to be fully divine moments of the one God. In mythological religion, they are experienced as diverse gods. That diversity of divinity is gathered up and understood to be contained by the one actual infinite God. This is not something that people can come to through their own resources. Christ brings mythology to an end because he overcomes this natural alienation of humanity from divinity in the mythological age. But in another respect, Christ brings revelation to an end because he points towards a moment in the future when that which is received as external and revealed and proclaimed by divinity or by prophets or through sacred texts, that external truth will no longer be external, will become the internal truth of reason itself. Christ, in Schelling's radical rethinking of Pauline Christology, is the herald of the rational religion to come. Schelling doesn't call it rational religion, he calls it philosophical religion. It will be the third stage of religion, following natural religion or mythology, revealed religion or Christendom, philosophical religion, which will comprehend both. And in philosophical religion, the externality of the divine to reason will be removed. In philosophical religion, the opposition of reason and religion will be removed. They will no longer be opposed to each other because they will become once again united like lover and beloved. Without this philosophical religion, we do not fully comprehend the history of religion. Philosophical religion, Schelling says, is necessary to a complete positive philosophy, because it will only be in the light of philosophical religion, it will only be when the content of revelation has become the inner content of reason, only then will we understand the true relationship of revelation to mythology and of both to the earliest history of humanity. Schelling has sketched in a partial way, in a speculative way, you could say in a fallibilist way, what he regards as the truth concerning history, but he has not arrived at the final science. And so in some respects, Schelling's whole effort is to show that positive philosophy is inescapably incomplete. Positive philosophy has not arrived at its end. Note the difference from Hegel here. Positive philosophy is not a complete system. It is open because history is not yet finished, and we have not yet arrived at that vantage point at which we will understand how all these parts fit together in one whole. Philosophical religion does not yet exist. And when it does exist, we will be emancipated, because the history of religion is the history of the emancipation of reason, a progressive emancipation. It begins with the most extreme domination of consciousness by divinity, passes through the mythological stage in which a first degree of freedom is achieved, to Christendom, in which the divine is now experienced as the free infinite, the personalizing infinite, the infinite which enters into a free relationship with humanity, and in that relationship frees humanity to its own freedom. Christianity, in Schelling's Philosophy of Revelation, is a religion of emancipation from religion. Now, the history of Revelation itself shows us the dynamic of emancipation at work. Catholicism is more dominated by Revelation than Protestantism is. And late Protestantism, or Enlightenment culture, is more free from Revelation than early Protestantism. We are moving progressively towards a moment of maximal freedom from Revelation. This is the great irony of Schelling's Philosophy of Revelation, that the goal is to be free from Revelation. But the reason why we need to be freed from Revelation, according to Schelling, is so that we can be free for Revelation. That is, only freedom from Revelation creates that personal distance, that stance of autonomy and relative sovereignty that could enter into a genuinely personal relationship with the divine.